am recording. So we are going to begin our discussion of the book of Job. We will get through, one and maybe 1.5 articles tonight. And then I am going to not be teaching for the next 3 weeks. So the next 2 weeks because of winter holidays, and we have family visiting, and like my life is going to be a little crazy. And then on the following week, I'm going to be actually at a rabbinic conference. So, and that'll give me time to actually really get my act together on the book of Job and look carefully into the text. So I am curious about what you think, what you know about the book of Job. I know, Jerry, you were tantalizing us with some maybe political background, and I don't have a modern commentary on the book of Job.
The beginning chapter was written after the whole thing was done.
So I think what you're saying is there is speculation that the beginning chapter was an add-on.
Yeah.
Okay.
But let's add the Satan.
Yes. So I'm familiar with the concept that the beginning chapters and the are separate.
Someone's
separate
typing
authorship.
really loud on
It's
the keyboard.
Ken is
It's Ken,
typing
yeah.
really loud.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say it, but it's Ken, yeah.
The beginning chapter, I understand, is generally understood to have a separate authorship. I don't know if there's an earlier or a later dating on that. But anyway, that's an interesting point. Any other thoughts about the book of Job before we start reading some of the articles?
Well, I mean, a lot of it doesn't make sense toward the end. I mean, all of a sudden, all his kids are killed, and then
That's actually in the beginning, but
he has kids again.
Yeah, that's in the end. So rather than saying a lot of it doesn't make sense, I'm sure you don't mean to disrespect the sanctity of the text, but
of course, no way.
Right.
Yeah.
But you can say you have trouble understanding or maybe believing the text. And I think even in Jewish tradition, there's doubt. I actually haven't dug deeply into this yet, but I think that there's a lot of speculation about, even in Jewish understanding, whether Job actually exists or whether he is a character introduced to address important theological questions.
Does it matter?
Yeah.
It could matter. Well, yeah, it can matter. It can matter to some people.
I don't want to think that God made a deal with the devil over some guy like a bet, but if it's a story to portray an answer, a meaning, then I'm good with that.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. Yes. And actually, yeah, that's actually a very interesting point. And I'm really enjoying a series I was talking with Jim before we started, taught by a Jewish scholar. In fact, he's an Orthodox Jewish scholar of New Testament and Jesus. And one of the things which is very common certainly in the New Testament and stories of Jesus are parables, right, Jim? There's a parable of this and there's a parable of that. And that actually is very rabbinic. You find that in the Talmud and in rabbinic literature. You don't find it so much in the Hebrew Bible, that that there's a parable. And I would say most parables are meant to be illustrative and not to be taken literally. I don't know if you would agree with that. The opening context of the story, as we'll see, is actually quite troubling, that God, in essence, engages in a bet with Satan. And it's actually necessary for the story, because we need to know that Job hasn't sinned. Because ultimately, the fundamental issue in the book of Job is actually it inspired a book. And in fact, 2 books. So I think you can see this. This is a book by Harold Kushner, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And this was, when it was first written, but this has sold millions of copies. And I guess the original copyright is 1980. And then he's actually written another book, and I'll talk more about this next time, which is same author, the Book of Job, When Bad Things Happen to a Good Person. Yes, to a good person, by Harold Kushner. So this book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, is a personal work of theology, which has a lot of commentary about the Book of Job and how Rabbi Kushner understands life. And then this book, which is much newer, is actually his detailed commentary on the Book of Job itself, rather than more focusing on his own story. Erwin.
I just wonder that, like all of us, when we pray to God, I'm sorry, not all of us, when we pray to God, we always want to have a proof that God listens to us. And when some bad things happen to good people, don't we try to make a deal with God that, okay, we're gonna do this thing and this thing if he helps us or she helps us in modern theology, because we don't know if he is a he or a she.
Yeah,
But I think Job tries to make deal with God, and that goes through the whole Job story.
yeah, so I do think many people share your wish to have proof that God is listening. Not everyone. I would guess not even a majority of the people on the screen. And I do think that the idea of making a deal with God, you know, if I do X, Y, and Z, will you grant me the following, is a concept that actually we see in the Bible. Jacob states it in almost exactly those terms. And I think that Job doesn't do that at all in the book, as we will see in the with a careful and a close reading. Bryce.
Another perhaps less satisfying reading of the book of Job is that one could perhaps satisfy oneself that if one's life is going downhill and seems to be beset left and right, that perhaps God is just using you to make a point.
Yeah, I think that's an awful reading of that book,
Yeah.
but it is a valid reading of the book. And if I believe that were true about my life, I would get another. No, this is very serious because it actually has a lot to do with my life.
I understand completely.
Right.
All I'm saying is that you can take the same set of facts and get a completely different and less optimistic view of the whole thing on the same facts.
Or I would actually state the exact thing that you just said in a slightly in a decidedly more positive vein. And that is that if bad things are happening in your life, one approach is to understand that God has a purpose in directing your life in this way, and that purpose is aimed at helping other people who are also going through bad things in their life. Ken Elman.
So I see it as a counterbalance to Deuteronomy.
Yes.
Where that theology that good is rewarded and bad is punished is obviously not happening in our lives, in our world. And this is a counterbalance because it's not always like that, but it's also not always like Job. There is a gray area in which we all live.
Right, and as you know, I've actually studied and met Harold Kushner several times, and I've heard him remark saying what people really wish he had written was a book called When Good Things Happen to Bad People, because that is even more annoying. Bryce again.
Just as an addendum to that, that actually lines up almost as if it were one of those old jokes, the one that goes, you know, when things are going really horrible for you, just remember all this too shall pass, and then you'll feel better. And then then you'll feel great. And then you'll remember that this too shall pass.
Yeah, it's actually not an old joke. I have a ring that has those words on it. I think I even right here. And it comes from a tradition about King Solomon, that
Mhm.
when you're on your highs, and you won't always be wonderful things happening, but also when things seem awful,
Yes.
it won't always seem
Everything
awful.
will pass.
Yes, Gamze Ya'avor. Okay, other thoughts? I know there are people here that don't like to chime in. There are others than the usual suspects that are very welcome to make contributions. Okay, so not hearing any, I am going to go to screen share. Oh, I'm gonna let me ask: is there anyone here who is concerned about their name appearing when you speak and don't want your image to show up? Wave at the camera, or okay. So I don't see anybody. I don't know, Helena, are you recording that problem, or you have a comment?
No, I was just going to say that, I've studied the book of Job before, and I believe it is fiction in the sense of, but I think all things like men write or women write these things to teach us lessons, to make us think. And I think that the book of Job made me think about different parts of my life and how I respond to these things, especially in a theological way, right? In my relationship with God and with the Jewish people, both.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Jerry?
So I think it's valuable. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
To
Sorry.
study.
I'll wait till she's done. I'm sorry. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Hold on,
Yeah,
Erwin. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah.
I'm holding on.
There's guy, when you think of the time period this was codified, put together, it's after the Babylonian exile, right?
Most
people
scholars
come
believe
back.
that, yes.
Well, Babylonians had a lot of writings like this. And there's documents that we have, that historical documents from archaeological documents about similar things that the Babylonians, even the Akkadians had, Assyrians, handed it down to them culturally. So it's not a unique story in that sense. So this could have been something that was brought back from Babylon, right? And a very useful tool, if you will, to help them deal with the world that they were in right now. You had the Greeks were coming in pretty strong at this time that this was put together, and rough things were happening and going to happen, right? So I think the context is important to understand that the world of people living in and how this would have been received.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that's important to keep in mind is books that are in the Bible have a status that's inherent with them being in the Bible. And you can, if you want to look at it from a historical point of view, there were a lot of books rattling around at the time. These books that we're studying are books that the rabbis who are putting together Judaism, both in Second Temple times, probably Second Temple times, and also Mishnaic times after the destruction of the temple. These are the ones that they selected more than 2,000 years ago to be the heart of our tradition and our people. So there might be 6 or 7, different stories. I mean, we hear about, Babylonian stories, the Emuna Elish, and there's, Greek mythology and so on. Those are interesting, and you can get a PhD studying them, but they're not canonized into our Bible, and that's ultimately why they are inherently worthy of study, not only as interesting literature in themselves, but the fact that they are at the heart of our tradition. And as we'll see with the book of Job, I think they are a record of people struggling with the question that we all struggle with, which is, if God is so wonderful, good, all powerful, and just, and so on, how is it that bad things happen to good people? And the fascinating thing about this text is that it presents the issue in starkly clear terms and presents it in a way that argues, I think as Ken Elman said, argues directly with the book of Deuteronomy. Book of Deuteronomy is in the Torah. It has a highly elevated status of holiness. Jim and I were talking about this. And now along comes the book of Job, which seems to be arguing directly with the book of Deuteronomy and setting it and contradicting it, which, if you think of it, is mildly outrageous and alarming. And it's something else that I discussed with Jim as we were getting on. We think of the Bible as a book, but that is an artifact of book binding and publication. The Hebrew Bible has 39 books, and they are separate books, and they have separate character. They were canonized. They were understood to be the sacred library of Judaism, but it doesn't mean they were all written by the same author and they all even agree with one another. Helena, I presume you are done, and Bryce, you just raised your hands.
Yeah, I want to raise an idea about good and evil, that this idea that you can have good without evil. They are defined in terms of one another. They are each an opposite along a spectrum. Okay, you can no more have good without evil. It's like having a North Pole without a South Pole. Okay, and so I would argue on thermodynamic grounds, if you try to move all of the good into one area, you're simply moving the evil into another.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't disagree with you, but it's just too abstract. The problem that Job faces, the problem that Rabbi Kushner faces, the problem that I face is suffering that clearly seems to be unjust. It's not an abstract issue of good and evil, and there has to be, black in order to have white. Right.
Well, I understand, but the corollary to that is that justice is not a guarantee. Justice is not something that exists. Good and evil are there, but justice isn't a feature of the world that we live in. We have to create our own.
Yeah, well, what I would say is Jewish tradition would say we rely on God for insight into what is just and what is not just.
Understood.
We've been having for weeks a discussion on Saturday mornings about what constitutes a just war and an unjust war. Okay, let's. I don't think I shared screen yet. No. So let me.
Yeah, you did. Oh.
Okay, so here we are. I presume you can see it. So the first article is actually a fairly short one from Torah.com. Oh no, I'm sorry. The first one is actually a short one from My Jewish Learning, called The Book of Job. I'll just read the introduction and ask for volunteers. I hope you can read it. The print isn't as big as others. The Book of Job challenges the simple equation of suffering and punishment by telling the story of one righteous man's confrontation with overwhelming misfortune, by Moshe Greenberg. So would someone who can actually read what's on the screen like to read?
If no one else can read it, I've got it on a big monitor.
Okay, why don't you go ahead, Bryce?
Okay. The book of Job begins with a prologue, which describes a wager between Satan and God, in which Satan, the adversary, bets God that Job, a particularly pious man, will abandon his piety and curse God if all his wealth and well-being are taken away. At the end of the prologue, Job has suffered many terrible losses, including his children and his health, but he nevertheless remains patient, refusing to speak against God.
Okay, so let me pause for a second. First, understand that this is actually the only book in the Hebrew Bible in which Hasatan, the adversary, has a major role. The Satan here is very different than the Satan that we see in a lot of more modern literature. And one of the
Have we seen Satan before, or is Satan a new entry?
I think there are some places where it is mentioned. in some of the prophets, I don't remember, but it's very much passing, not a central feature.
Well, I understand.
And-
Well,
and-
what I
and-
mean is, this doesn't feel Jewish, because now all of a sudden you're setting up this feels more Christian, because you've got this idea of God having an adversary that he is in a battle with of some kind, and that hasn't really turned up anywhere
But
else.
in Exodus and Numbers, Satan is mentioned.
Yeah. So, and I don't remember what exact, role it plays there. Here, unlike in some Christian thought, Satan is not like a divine creature in opposition to God. Here, it's more like it's called the adversary, more like a district attorney, is somebody who is looking for crimes, looking for problems. And there is no sense in Judaism that Satan has any independent power over God. There is. Yeah, go ahead, Erwin.
I just wonder if in Gan Eden, the snake could be represent Satan.
You'll have to talk to Jim about that, because that is a Christian interpretation, which never makes it into Judaism, and
Serpent.
also doesn't make it into Islam. Actually, Satan is in the Garden of Eden in Islam, but there's no snake. So in
Okay.
Judaism, the serpent is a serpent. It's not Satan.
Okay.
But we certainly associate. The other thing I want to mention, I'll probably talk about this when we get deeply into the text. Actually, God begins this discussion by saying, "Hey, prosecuting attorneys and angels, have you seen my servant Job, how faithful and loyal he is?" And Satan says, "No, well, not so fast. He's loyal and so on, because he has it good. Suppose he didn't have all these blessings in his life, he might not be so loyal." And the rabbis actually pick up this theme in discussing Lashon Hara, which is often called the evil tongue or forbidden speech. And you may not know this, and you may actually have a problem with this, but the essential element of Lashon Hara is words have a lot of power. And you got to be careful what you say about someone, even positive things. Because if I said to you, if I made an announcement, about a friend or somebody we all know, about what a wonderful person this guy is, it might well be that somebody picks up by saying, "Oh yeah, well, I don't think he's all that great. And let me tell you, the problem he has." So you can actually cause problems, and we'll get into some maybe specific examples later. But that's one of the lessons that the rabbis draw. God begins by praising Job, and this gets Job into trouble. You could argue even gets God into trouble. So Bryson and Jerry.
Yeah, so something occurred to me, the tone of the description of God summoning the ethereal host,
Heavenly court. Yeah, the heavenly host.
court, the ethereal host, whatever you want to call them, to show them the fruits of his,
Yeah,
I don't know,
to brag
yeah,
about Job.
whatever you want to say, but and I don't ask you to defend God. It's just an idea that occurred to me, that people can consider. But was God teaching, or was God bragging?
Yeah, I don't know.
But that's just a thing to
Yes.
consider.
But what the rabbis draw is, even if you're trying to say something good about someone, you should be very careful with your speech, because
Yes.
speech has power and it can lead to unintended consequences, which I believe is true. Jerry.
I think, isn't there a book written, Telushkin, was it?
Telushkin
Or-
wrote a book called Words That Hurt and Words That
Yeah.
Heal.
It's all about
Yes,
this, yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I just want to be clear with something. So before I said something wasn't correct. So the first time in the Tanakh that Satan appears is actually in Job. Prior to that, it's a commentary from Rashi.
Okay.
Ah,
Okay.
So it's in
Yeah,
commentary.
and I do
Rashi, of
think,
course, is
I
medieval,
do
so-
think that Satan appears also in the Bible, but I'm not certain.
Yeah,
But not,
yeah,
but
the
not
first
as,
time-
but not as a key figure like this.
No, the first
And
time.
in the Talmud, there's great stuff about Satan.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
and it's,
but
and
but
it's,
to be
yes,
very clear, the first time that the Hebrew word Satan
Satan.
appears in the text is in Job. Prior to that, it's in commentary.
So,
and
so one could argue then that this kind of adversary character is somewhat of a new thing within the corpus of Judaism,
Yeah.
and that it certainly could be an influence from outside events, considering this is a very late addition.
This is not very late. This
Oh,
is
okay.
second temple, Ken.
I see. Okay.
So just again, in terms of Lashon Hara, Sfat Emet is the guy who writes all about this. And
Right.
he even goes so far as to say, you can't say, hey, this person makes a great spread for Shabbat because he may go broke because everybody goes to his house to go see what this
Oh,
great
yeah,
spread
that's
is.
interesting, yeah. Yeah. So, at the risk of belaboring this point, there was a man who saved the life of President Ford. President Ford, a nice, sweet guy, actually had 2 assassination attempts on him, and I think both were fairly young women.
Yes.
And a ex-Marine happened to be standing next to one of these women, a guy named Oliver Sipple, and I think it was Squeaky Fromm or something. I don't remember who it
Wasn't
was.
that Squeaky Fromm?
No, was it? Yes? No?
Yeah.
Okay. She pulls out a gun and is going to shoot Ford. This ex-Marine grabs her, as instinct and saves the president's life. As you can imagine, the press is extremely interested in knowing more about the guy who saved the president's life. He protests and protests and protests, saying, no, I just reacted, I'm an ex-Marine. I reacted out of instinct. I'm a private person. I don't want you people digging into my life. And it turns out this was in San Francisco, and he was gay. And, at this time, and not everybody who was gay was proud of it or out. And his parents in particular were not aware that he was gay. And this came out, and it, it separated him from his parents and childhood friends and so on. And he ultimately died. I don't know if he committed suicide, but he died sort of in horrible circumstance because the press wanted to write good things about this guy who did a good deed. It's a classic example. Erwin.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. First of all, do you think Job knew about the wager between God and Satan?
There is no evidence in the text that Job knew about it. And that's actually
And
one of the reasons.
my other question is, how would Job behave if he would know that our life is predetermined?
If he would know or if he would think?
He would.
I mean, do you believe our lives are predetermined?
I believe it very much so.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think Job has that concept, nor do I think the Bible in this text has that concept of our lives being predetermined. Jerry. You're muted, Jerry.
Very simply, I think God was defending Job and not so much anything else, is that here is a good man and Satan was talking against him and saying
No. As you'll see when we read the story, God starts talking about Job, and Satan says, well, maybe if he wasn't so blessed
right.
and had all this good stuff, he wouldn't be so faithful and loyal. So God is not defending Job. In fact, God says, okay, Satan, take away his first his family, have all of his children
And
killed,
see what happens.
and
But
his riches, and
but
see what
God
happens.
God knew that Job would still be faithful.
Yeah. So then why would he allow Satan to do this? So
Exactly.
So I don't think the Bible embraces the idea of God's omniscience. So I don't think God knew. But in any event, I think the whole thing is a pretextual story to examine the very serious question of how we reconcile suffering with people who are living a good life. And that's the purpose of the story. So this rather strange setup is necessary to set the story. And it's also necessary to read a little bit of this text. So Bryce, would you like to continue with the tone of the work?
The tone of the work abruptly changes, however, in chapter 3, as Job begins his poetic speeches by cursing the day on which he was born. This central section consists of the comforting words of his friends who try to persuade Job that if he is suffering, he must have sinned, and Job's increasingly bitter retorts that he is innocent and that his punishment is undeserved. Job ultimately calls God to court, as it were, to answer the charge of injustice, and Job does receive an answer, 2 speeches by God from the midst of a storm or whirlwind, the meaning of which have been the subject of much theological speculation.
So one of my teachers, Dr. Tamara Eskenazi, said people who believe in the patience of Job have only read the first 2 chapters of Job. And there's, I don't know, there's like 40, how many chapters? There's at least 40 something, 41, 42 chapters. Yeah, Job is not patient at all. Bryce, why don't you continue? We'll get through
The
this.
book closes with an epilogue in 42, 717. Yes, there you go, 42 chapters. Conventionally, as it began, almost as though Job had not uttered a single negative word. He recovers and is given a new family. It is generally understood by modern scholars that the central poetic section of the book, in which Job is forced by his changed circumstances to reject his simplistically pious views, was ironically and intentionally set between the beginning and end of a conventionally pious story of a man called Job who remained faithful to God in his suffering. The result is a work which overturns, in many respects, the conventional biblical view that suffering is the result of sin.
Yeah, one really interesting point is that if you just read the opening 2 chapters and the closing epilogue, the book is kind of like a golden book, child's biblical book. Job, remained faithful in spite of horrible conditions, and he got new kids and new riches, and everything turned out great in the end. And it's not actually a terribly interesting book. It would kind of make us groan. So the setup in the first 2 chapters is actually necessary to understand what Job is going through, and also necessary to make it clear that Job is unjustly suffering. Because one answer, if we just read the middle sections of the book without the opening, we might agree with Job's friends that the reason he's suffering is he has in fact sinned. And we hear Job saying, I haven't sinned, but we don't know whether it's true or not. The opening 2 chapters of the book tell us that Job hasn't sinned. Ken, I don't know if Erwin's hand is up intentionally or not, but Ken, go ahead.
So one of the problems that I have is that all is not good at the end. He still lost 10 children.
Right.
If I were to lose my 2 children and my grandkids, there would be no way that replacing them with 2 other kids and
Yes.
would suffice.
Yes.
I would still not be whole.
Oh, Ken, 1 kid is pretty much the same as any other.
Yeah. So I without fully going to Bryce's sarcasm, it's actually interesting to remember that in these times, 50% of children would die before they were 1, and another 50% of children would die before they were 15 or 16. So losing children, while tragic, was not at all unusual. Certainly not in the way that we hear about in Job. Yes, Jerry.
Yeah, I like other Jerry's reaction to that. I agree with you are It's horrifying. She's right. And so that's why when I said, does it matter? If we get hung up on placing reality, a net of reality over this,
Yes.
we'll never get through it.
Yes.
So one of the point though.
Never Get Through It is my middle name. Just responding, and there's a discussion in the Talmud. I can't even remember what the discussion is about. Is when bad things happen, that although they're really bad, they're not all that unusual, and they use as an example a young child dying shortly after they're born. That it's bad, but it's not all that unusual. And as you may know, in Jewish law, you don't have full mourning, mourning, as a full funeral and sitting shiva and so on, for a child who doesn't reach the age of 30 days. And the reason is, if there were full mourning rites for such children in ancient times, the community would always be in mourning because it was so common. Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that just right now I made the connection to, this is really similar to other stories in the Bible. Like, for instance, Abel is favored by God, and yet he immediately dies. And Abraham is chosen by God, and he's asked to sacrifice his son. And then in the end, he winds up being able to keep his son because God provides a sacrifice. And so it's really not, this is really riffing off of ideas that are already there. It's not like a new concept of, sin and punishment. And
the Bible is complex and not simplistic. And, one of the things, as you were speaking, I'm reminded that after the episode with Abraham and Isaac and the near sacrifice, God never speaks to Abraham again. Abraham and Isaac never speak to each other again. And the next thing that happens in the Torah is Sarah drops dead. And by the way, in the Hebrew ordering of the Bible, this is the last book in which God says anything, which I didn't realize till I started reading some of my sources preparing. Ken Elman.
So putting things in perspective, even within the last couple hundred years, our life expectancy has gone from 42 to 80 something, not because we live longer, but because of infant mortality and the big, huge change in infant mortality in the last. Yep.
Okay, let's press on. I really do want to at least finish this article tonight. Bryce, what the book of Job is about.
What the book of Job is about. Sorry. Job is a book not so much about God's justice as about the transformation of a man whose piety and view of the world were formed in a setting of wealth and happiness, and into whose life burst calamities that put an end to both. How can piety nurtured in prosperity prove truly deep-rooted and disinterested, and not merely a spiritual adjunct of good fortune? God has been good to me, so I am faithful to him. Can a man pious in prosperity remain pious when he is cut down by anarchical events that belie his orderly view of the world? The book of Job tells how one man suddenly awakened to the anarchy rampant in the world, yet his attachment to God outlived the ruin of his tidy system.
I'm going to scroll up a little bit.
Job is a pious believer who is struck by misfortune so great that it cannot be explained in the usual way as a prompting to repentance, a warning, let alone a punishment. The arguments later addressed to him by his friends. His piety is great enough to accept the misfortune without rebelling against God. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? But his inability during 7 days of grief in the company of his silent friends to find a reasonable relation between the misfortune and the moral state of its victims, himself and his children, opens Job's eyes to the fact that in the world at large, the same lack of relation prevails.
And we'll see, he sits quietly after his children die for 7 days, and this is the origin, if not one of several origins, for the concept of Shiva and observing Shiva and sitting low and uncomfortable. Cheryl. You're muted, Chair.
I mean, I do get bothered sometimes by the idea that, you know, don't worry about your suffering in this world because the world to come is so much better.
Right. So that's one answer to the question, why do good people suffer in this world? And one answer to that, which I don't find personally satisfying, is don't worry, your suffering in this world is actually Yesurin shel ahava. In rabbinic terminology, the sufferings of love, that we are actually earning our share in the world to come by suffering in this world. The question is, how do we get God off the hook about being all just, all good, all powerful, and everything? And one answer is, in the world to come, the good will be rewarded for their good deeds, and the evil will be punished for their bad deeds. And I
well,
would say
since nobody's come back to report to us, I have a little issue with that.
Yes. So I would say that's a simplistic and to some unsatisfying, notably Rabbi Harold Kushner, not satisfied with that explanation, and to others, I find it very satisfying. Okay, let's continue. Bryce, press on.
The purpose of the prologue. The prologue of the book, telling of Satan's wager and the subsequent disaster that befell Job, has been a scandal to many readers. But the prologue is necessary, first of all, to establish Job's righteousness, to depict the effect of dire misfortune that demolishes the faith of a perfectly blameless man in a just divine order is the author's purpose. The book is not merely an exposition of ideas, a theological argument, but the portrait of a spiritual journey from simple piety to the sudden painful awareness and eventual acceptance of the fact that inexplicable misfortune is the lot of man.
Oops, sorry.
You went too far.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Without the prologue, we should lack the essential knowledge that Job's misfortune really made no sense. Without the prologue, the friend's arguments that misfortune indicates sin would be plausible, and Job's resistance to them liable to be construed as moral arrogance. The prologue convinces us from the outset of Job's integrity, hence we can never side with the friends. For Job is a paradigm. He never was or existed, says a Talmudic rabbi, except as an example. He personifies every pious man who, when confronted with an absurd disaster, is too honest to lie in order to justify God. The author must convince his reader that Job's self-estimation is correct, and that therefore his view of moral disorder in God's management of the world is warranted. That is one purpose of the prologue. The poetic speeches. The speeches of Job reveal the collapse of his former outlook. For the first time in his life, he has become aware of the prevalence of disorder in the government of the world. In his former state of well-being, Job would hardly have countenanced in himself or in others a death wish. In his misfortune, however, he expresses it vehemently. Could Job, in his prosperity, have appreciated the anguish of victims of senseless misfortune, or have regarded God as an enemy of man? Job would previously have responded to despair of God as his friends, and Elihu responded to him in his misery and despair. For Job's friends were his peers ideologically, no less than socially. He belonged to their circle both in deed and in creed. Nice turn of phrase. A chasm opened between him and them only because of a disaster that Job alone knew to be undeserved.
Okay, before we go on, Erwin, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I want to ask you what do you think it's any relation to say when we read Psalm 126:5, when we plant seed in tears, we harvest in joy.
So I would say that that's a sweet reading from the Psalms, but there are people that plant seeds in tears and
That's-
continue crying and have a miserable life.
You know,
I mean, it's
Job, you know, and you know, I think you know, it's a very difficult for me to understand Job. You know,
yes, okay,
because
that's why we're
of-
gonna
it's
that's
such a controversial section in the Bible.
yes. So the
that-
fact that it's in the
because,
Bible is very important.
Yeah,
Because
because I think when we suffer, or most of us, when we suffer, we always ask, why me?
right.
That's the first question we ask.
That's not always true.
Hold on, let's not argue.
Maybe you are a different person, Bryce.
Yeah, so I would say having spent a lot of time with suffering people, that is very common, that people will often ask, and I think it's a reasonable question, which we will discuss. And the fact that this book is in the Bible is an important representation that the creators of Judaism, and here I'm thinking of the rabbis and others that canonized the Bible, wanted us to struggle with this question. This is, our tradition is not a simplistic sow in tears, you know, and reap in gladness. Everything really works out for the best. Everybody's really happy, and we live happily ever after. Our tradition is too sophisticated to be satisfied with that kind of simplistic answer. But I would like to have Bryce press on. God's answer to Job.
God's answer to Job. The outcome of the drama is that the collapse of a complacent view of the divine economy can be overcome. For Job, this came about through a sudden, overwhelming awareness of the complexity of God's manifestation in reasonless phenomena of nature. Job's flood of insight comes in a storm, we may suppose, through the experience of its awesomeness. One may compare and contrast the midrashic wordplay that has Job hearing God's answer out of a hair, which is a homonym of storm in Hebrew, from contemplation of a microcosm. The grand vista of nature opens before Job, and it reveals the working of God in a realm other than man's moral order.
I'm going to scroll up a bit.
Job responds to, and thus gets a response from, the numinous presence underlying the whole panorama. He hears God's voice in the storm. The fault in the moral order, the plane on which God and man interact, is subsumed under the totality of God's work, not all of which is reasonable. Senseless calamity loses some of its demoralizing effect when morale, or is it moral or morale?
I think they are morale.
When morale does not depend entirely on the comprehensibility of the phenomena, I think it's moral. While when moral does not depend entirely on the comprehensibility of the phenomenon, but rather on the conviction that they are pervaded by the presence of God. As nature shows, this does not necessarily mean that they are sensible and intelligent. And by the way, Rabbi, intelligible, sorry, where moral and morale here, but right up above there, that's an instance in English of the ambiguity that one can get from Hebrew.
Except, isn't the word moral spelled without a final E? I'm not sure.
Might, but you know what? Moral fits as well.
Yes, there's a lot of examples like that, tear and tear, and
yes,
and so on. Let's go on.
The God of nature, powerful and uncanny. It has been objected that God's speeches are irrelevant to Job's challenge. God, the objection runs, asserts his power in reply to a challenge to his moral government. But this sets up a false dichotomy. To be sure, God's examples from nature are exhibitions of his power, but they are also exhibitions of his wisdom and his providence for his creatures. Through nature, God reveals himself to Job as both purposive and non-purposive, playful and uncanny, as evidenced by the monsters he created. To study nature is to perceive the complexity, the unity of contraries in God's attributes, and the inadequacy of human reason to explain his behavior, not the least in his dealings with man. For it may be inferred that in God's dealings with man, this complexity is also present, a unity of opposites, reasonability, justice, playfulness, uncanniness, the latter appearing demonic in the short view. When Job recognizes in the God of nature with his fullness of attributes, the very same God revealed in his own individual destiny, the tumult in his soul is stilled. He has fathomed the truth concerning God's character. He is no longer tortured by a concept that fails to account for the phenomena, as did his former notion of God's orderly working. Job's transformation and the epilogue. Job ends up a wiser man, for he sees better the nature of God's work in the world and recognizes the limitations of his former viewpoint. The manifestation of his peace with God, of his renewed spiritual vigor, is that he reconstitutes his life. He is a vessel into which blessings can be poured. He who wished to have died at birth now fathers new sons and daughters. That, in addition to answering the demands of simple justice, is the significance of the epilogue, which many critics have belittled as crass. The book of Job challenges reward and punishment. This concept of God contradicts not only that of wisdom of the wisdom of the Proverbs, in which the principle of just individual retribution is iterated in its simplest form, but that of the Torah and the prophets as well. These writings bear the imprint of God's saving acts, the Exodus and the conquest. They represent God as the maintainer of the moral order and interpret events in terms of reward and punishment. A more complex view of God's justice. The religious sensibility apparently absorbs or even affirms the contradictions embodied in these books. That may be because these contradictions are perceived to exist in reality. Sorry?
Well, go ahead.
One can see in individual life as in collective life a moral causality, which the religious regard as divinely maintained, indeed, as a reflection of God's attributes. Evil recoils upon the evildoers, whether individual or collective. Goodness brings blessings. At the same time, the manifestation of this causality can be so erratic or so delayed as to cast doubt on its validity as the single key to the destiny of men and nations. Hence, the sober believer does not pin his faith solely on a simple axiom of the divine maintenance of moral causality, but neither will he altogether deny its force. No single key unlocks the mystery of destiny. Within our ken is neither the tranquility of the wicked nor the suffering of the righteous. But for all that, the sober believer does not endorse nihilism. Wisdom, Torah, and prophets continue to represent for him one aspect of causality in events which he can confirm in his own private experience, but one aspect only. The other stands beyond his moral judgment, though it is still under God, namely, the mysterious or preordained decree of God, toward which the proper attitude is, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him.
Okay, so the book of Job is not simple, and neither is this article.
Yeah.
Actually, before I completely abandon screen share, I'm going to go back and point out the second article, which I sent, which is actually a much longer article from Torah.com, which focuses on a key issue in the book. And maybe we'll read this after we read the text carefully. Speaking truth to power, Job accuses God of being unjust. Bryce.
Yeah, I found that last article to be extremely thought-provoking. What's interesting is the take I got from Job being exposed to the inner workings of God's workings,
Yes.
so to speak. And Job, to see all of that had to go on to make the world work, and that his idea of a simple moral justice occurring throughout life was an overly simplistic view, and that he realized that random things would occur that had nothing to do with justice, with a simple moral equivalency.
Yeah, I think that's what the book is about. And I think those of us who want to have a very simple, oh gosh, I don't mean to belittle this, but a Santa Claus is coming to town view of God, namely that God is watching over us and we will be rewarded for good deeds and we will be punished for bad deeds, and everything is really okay because God is just and merciful, and it's a pretty simple equation. We'll be upset by the book of Job. And so on the other hand, for Rabbi Kushner and for me, the book of Job and Kushner's commentary allows me to remain in a deep, powerful relationship with God in spite of tragedy, which, like every one of you, affects my life. And so therefore, I find the book of Job to be tremendously comforting. But I rejoice in the complexity of it, and not in a simplistic view that everything really is fine and okay, and if can't explain something, the answer is my usual answer, that God knows. But it's that is not going to make everybody happy, and that's why the book of Job is controversial and upsetting to many. And so this may not be for everybody. So
I'm looking forward to it.
So I'm forewarning you. You all have a copy of the book of Job. It is in your Bible, Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible. It's there. And if you haven't ever read When Bad Things Happen to Good People, I encourage you to read it. It is I find it very, very helpful.
Yes.
So any other thoughts before we call it an evening? So on Monday night, we will be meeting on Wednesday night. We're talking about Jewish movements, and then I'll be dark for 3 weeks. And that gives you plenty of time to read the book of Job in the Bible and to read the When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Jim.
Oh, okay. I think you just answered it. I was when we did like Esther and such, we read through the whole thing. So, but we're not going to read through the book of Job together.
We are going to read a lot of the book of Job. As you will see if you start getting into it, well, you saw it's 42 chapters. And there are long and flourishing speeches. And one of the reasons this is going to take me a little more work than usual is I'm going to need to pick and choose. I want to capture the essence of what's in the speeches, but I'm not going to, if we really read through all 42 chapters, it's going to take 3 or 4 months. And I don't think we need to read the entire book, but you all have it. So if you want to, read more of it, you want to read all there are series of speeches where he's got 3 friends and each friend speaks and then he answers them. And just when you think you are running out of energy to read this, another friend named Elihu shows up, and then finally God shows up, but God doesn't. Well, God actually does have the last word. Erwin.
I think I am here today, and I have the belief what I have because my worldly experience.
Yeah. Well, the internet
good or
interfered with your
bad.
conclusion because we can't understand what you're saying.
And that's what Job teaches.
Yeah, we could not. The reason we're laughing, Erwin, the reason we're
So
laughing is
that's what he teaches.
we couldn't understand what you said. It sounded like Aramaic to the rest of us. So do you want to just repeat for us what Job teaches?
Maybe I said, no, I said I am here today and I am believe what I believe because of my worldly experience, good or bad.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, and I would comment that amongst Holocaust survivors, of which you are one, there are some that came through that experience, which, if you think about it, is the essence of unjust suffering. And some people came through that experience by denying God and rejecting God and being very bitter and, suicides and so on. Others like you, Erwin, are an inspiration to us because you came through the experience with your faith intact. And people, have observed that Holocaust survivors went on, like Job, to have more children and to build families. And, I would say many of us may know children of Holocaust survivors. It's not so easy to know Holocaust survivors, but know children of Holocaust survivors. And so the book of Job is very powerful because Job is an example.
Wiesel never lost his.
I'm sorry?
I said one of the example is Elie Wiesel never lost his faith, even the darkest hours.
Right.
When you read his book.
Right.
He is an example of that. Primo Levi, who also wrote many books about the Holocaust, committed suicide.
Yeah.
So not everybody comes out of this wrestling with God in the same place. For me, Job gives me a roadmap of preserving my faith in spite of tragedy. And I find that very helpful because if I were simply to say, God doesn't allow unjust suffering, I would look at my life and the life of my children, and I would say, clearly that's not true, therefore there is no God. And so the book of Job gives me a path, and Rabbi Kushner gives me a path of understanding that.
Yes. Very comforting.
Yeah, it is comforting, but it's not simple.
No.
It's not simple. This is not simple material. But anyway, so I think
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Just reading this last one, because every time I study this, I see something different.
Mhm.
And it struck me, and I could have just misinterpreted this, the natural order that God created is death, right? Is dying and death. And I looked, and then it's not easy to accept. I'm not saying that, but was he saying some of that in this article about the natural order?
Well, at the end of the book of Job, Job is complaining. Basically, Job summons God to be defendant, judge, and jury in the trial of Job versus God. Right. And God's response is, who are you to think you can possibly understand my ways? Yeah. Were you there when I created the snows and in the heavens, when I created Leviathan? Basically, do you understand everything that I have done? No. What makes you think you can understand this? And Job is silenced into speech. And I have, I know particularly Jim will enjoy 10 different translations of Job's key line at the end of the book. But for me, and just to give away what I think is the most powerful punchline of all, is Job's friends basically preach good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, which is what the book of Deuteronomy teaches. That's what the Torah teaches.
Curses and
Okay.
blessings.
And God in the end of the book of Job says your friends are wrong. So God in the book of Job is saying it's not as simple as it is in the book of Deuteronomy. And that to me is an astounding thing to find in the Bible, is essentially the Bible contradicting itself. I mean, this is to me is the clearest example of that, but we also see it in other books of the Bible. In books of the Bible, you're forbidden to have intermarriage, and you're forbidden to allow a Midianite into the community. And then you have the story of Ruth, where the result of an intermarriage is going to be the birth of King David. So there's all kinds of interesting things going on. I love that the Hebrew Bible is not simplistic.
Me too.
Not everybody loves that idea. Bryce.
And I love you see different things every time you study.
Oh yeah, I mean that's
It's just
the joy.
a blessing, it just energizes me.
There's a Southern California scholar in residence program. It's where I'm listening to this Jewish scholar about Jesus, and it has a T-shirt which may alarm you, and on the T-shirt it says Jews for exegesis, which I love. But the only problem with it is everyone will misinterpret it, except for those few who won't understand it. And about 2 or 3 people will actually understand it. Exegesis is exactly what you're describing, Helena. It's digging into the text to extract more information and more wisdom from the text. It has nothing to do with who. Sorry.
Yeah. and it brings, isn't this why you study Torah? It brings you back.
Yes.
There's a curiosity and a seeking. I've always been a seeker. Right. And when my daughter was diagnosed 2 years ago with ovarian cancer, and we found out we all had the BRCA gene, it was really, I just couldn't understand why this would happen. And studying Torah has been the greatest gift to me, and to be with people who also seek these answers.
Right.
And, she's doing well, but it showed me that the natural order of things isn't what I think.
Right.
I don't have the mind of God.
And if you have a simple answer, you are no longer a seeker.
Yeah.
I don't know, Bryce, you had your hand up, and maybe
I had my hand up,
but I'm not sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what was interesting when you just stated a few moments ago that in the end, God parades before Job all these, this speech. Were you there when I created the snows? Did you so forth and da 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 da? How can you possibly understand my workings and the things that I do and the consequences of and you get this idea. But what God doesn't say is, I did this on a bet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
Because
so
the
it's
poem
a
is unaware.
dodge in a way.
The poem is unaware of the bet.
What's interesting is it's kind of a dodge that God does, where he goes, majesties and mysteries.
Yes.
But the point is, it was a bet.
Yes, but the poem is unaware of the bet.
Okay.
So
that doesn't make it any less ironic.
To say it was a bet gone bad robs the story of its power.
So the poem?
So you have an opening to Job where God and Satan make a bet, and Job, although we know Job is pious and loyal, he loses his family, he loses the farm, and he gets horribly sick. That's the I can't remember what it was called in this article, the prologue. The prologue.
Yeah.
And in the end, Job lives happily ever after. Those chapters don't seem to be recognized by the poem is the intervening 39 chapters.
Oh, the poem is 39 chapters.
The poem is 39 chapters. There's a prologue and there's an
Okay.
epilogue.
all right.
Yeah. So if in the end, God, instead of talking about the power of the universe and would have just said, you know what, it was a dumb bet, I'm really sorry, then the book wouldn't deserve our attention. So the purpose of the
Understood.
prologue is to set it up clearly that Job really is innocent of anything that would be responsible for this suffering. Because if Job has done something to deserve the suffering, or if there's another simplistic answer, then there's no power to the book.
So in essence, it's like taking a statue that has been created by somebody and putting it into an entirely different setting that changes its meaning. Because if the interior book is unaware of the outer portions, okay, then you have a strong case to make that this is a body of work that was then used to make a point by adding a prologue and an epilogue.
Yes, I agree with that. Erwin, I don't know if you have any other things you wanted to add. Your hand was up.
No, I
Okay.
can.
Okay. Well, having said all that, I wish you a good.
Jim have something to say?
Sorry.
Does Jim have something to
Oh,
say?
yeah, thank
Oh.
you. I just, we were, Helena, what you said, it's funny because Rabbi and I were talking about the very subject. You were talking about how fulfilling it is to study Torah, but we're not studying Torah tonight.
Okay. So actually,
I
Actually-
consider it to study Talmud, Torah, Midrash,
Yes.
all of it.
Okay.
yes. So
Any of
the
it.
word Torah is a very broad word, which can mean the first 5 books of the Bible,
Yeah.
or it can mean all of sacred literature.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
The
that.
Hebrew
All right.
word Torah means instruction. The blessing
Okay.
that we say before we begin our study
That's
ends
right.
with God commanding us la'asok b'divrei Torah, to occupy ourselves with words of Torah, even though we might be studying Talmud or Jewish law or the book of Job.
Commentary even.
Yeah.
Commentary.
It's all
Yeah.
Torah. It's
Thank
not
you.
just the first 5 books. Yeah, it's a very important concept. Okay, gang, I
Good
wish you a
night.
good evening. Jim, I wish you a Merry Christmas. I'm
Thank
not
you,
sure if there's
sir.
anybody else
Merry
here.
Christmas, Jim.
There's anybody else here who
Thank you.
observes, or maybe
No.
even some of us who are observing for the last time before conversion.
You can
Uh,
come and have our Christmas dinner at our shul.
Yep.
Oh,
I'm going out for Chinese food.
Yes.
Yeah, Chinese food is a blessing.
And a movie.
Yeah, Chinese food and a
That's
movie.
it.
That's what, yeah.
Once for Chinese food in a movie at my congregation in Camarillo, I found Jewish fortune cookies,
oh, that's
which they weren't as good as I hoped that they would be.
And
Um,
are you going
Because
to
they were
tell
made of matzah.
them sad?
no, I'm not talking about the cooking. I'm talking about the saying inside. But one
Yeah,
of my
what?
favorites,
What? You think you got indigestion?
yeah, there's only one that I actually remember, which is maybe this is even slightly insulting, but the one who marries for money earns it.
Yes, that's true. Right.
Well said. Have a good night.
Okay,
Good
okay.
night.
Good night, all.
night.
And we'll
Take
see you
care.
in what,
See
3
some-
weeks, Rabbi, or 2? 3
Yeah,
weeks.
no,
No,
it's gonna be 3
yeah.
weeks from Monday nights. I will
All right.
send emails.
Monday.
Yes.
But we'll
Take care.
see you Wednesday, right?
I'll be here
Wednesday's-
Wednesday and probably, I think we're continuing on Shabbat morning for those of you.
How's the hip doing?
The hip is great. It's astounding. It is astounding.
Glad you're better.
It
Are
it
you
is
walking without a
it better?
cane?
Oh, I am walking. There are times when I will be walking when I won't even remember that I've had surgery. It's only
Yeah.
like
Wow.
bending
Nice.
and stretching.
So,
Yeah,
so
it's-
now is it better than it was
Yes.
before you had the surgery?
Yes,
Oh, God, yeah.
Yes.
God, it's
Yep.
10 years
Excellent.
for me and I'm still hurting.
and I
There
can
is a God.
comply with the 614th commandment, which is let my people golf. I'm looking forward to that in about a
Happy
month.
New Year.
Yeah.
Happy-
Happy
take
New
care.
Year.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Take care.